Afternoon, GrabTube. If you've been following my videos, you'll know that I've been working on a first-person survival horror game being made in RPG Maker. And I previously made a video talking about why I'm using that engine. Today, I want to play devil's advocate with myself and talk about why not to use RPG Maker, and talk about all of the downsides to using RPG Maker and why it may not be the best engine for my purposes. At the end of the day, the conclusion I'll come to, of course, is that I am still going to use RPG Maker, but I think it would be interesting to talk about the limitations and how I'll be working within those to create the best experience that I can. RPG Maker is an engine which is designed to create 2D role-playing games with ease, but what happens when you try to make a 3D horror game, taking it out of its comfort zone? Today I'm going to talk about a lot of the cons that I'm facing. Quite a strange, novel idea. Firstly, RPG Maker is specifically designed for 2D games. The interface is streamlined and designed for creating tile-based maps, turn-based combat, and classic RPG storytelling. It's beginner-friendly and perfect for making 2D games, but when you want to create a 3D horror game, the engine does show some serious limitations. One of the biggest issues of using RPG Maker for a 3D horror game is that it's fundamentally a 2D engine. Sure, the plugin allows for 3D features, but they can be limited and a little bit clunky and not optimised as much as a dedicated 3D engine. In a 3D horror game, the world around you has to feel immersive with depth, lighting and intricate details, but RPG Maker was never built for that. And no matter how hard I try to force the 3D elements onto it, the results can often look jarring and unpolished. Now, the reason I don't think this is necessarily going to hold me back is because for creating a horror game, I think having this uncanny quirkiness will actually prove to be a benefit, especially in this day and age of AI-generated art, just general slot content. I think having this passion project, which is very clearly my own, work, maybe it's a cope for me, but I do believe it makes something a little bit more unique. Now, moving on to the next issue, the main thing I see is to do with collision. So this is something that's actually been limiting me quite a bit. And it's because I have to work around, because RPG Maker's collision systems were not designed for any kind of action combat or anything particularly fast-paced. They're more designed to be used as like triggers for cutscenes and things like that. However, using variables to track the player's position and monitoring positions of enemies or potentially projectiles, I can work around this. However, the grid-based system will still ultimately mean that any kind of collision is determined based on that grid-based format, so everything snaps to a position on a grid. The reason I don't think this is going to hold me back too much is because I can work around this with the game's design and essentially create a first-person sort of dungeon crawler perspective where the character turns on 90-degree angles. This gives a close perspective on objects. Following on from that, I have seen a lot of people talk about the limitations on the aspect ratio and on the resolution of images. However, as part of the 3D plugin, there is a scale command which allows me to use events and characters which are much bigger than the usual RPG Maker format and simply scale them down in gameplay, and this way I'm able to create much more detailed objects. So let's talk about performance. RPG Maker isn't optimised to handle complex 3D scenes. It would struggle with handling 3D objects and lighting effect. The way I'm working around this is by using essentially 2D textures and objects, but without the use of actual 3D objects. So there are no literal 3D objects, it's more sort of like Paper Mario or Mode 7 on the SNES. So while more professional engines like Unity or Unreal would certainly create a more polished look, and the fact that so many people already use those engines to create those types of games, I think trying something unique and probably a little bit wrong is actually something that could create something truly memorable, for me anyway. Probably another major drawback to using RPG Maker is essentially the perception that it has in the indie game community. RPG Maker, for better or worse, is seen as a childish, baby's first game engine, essentially. Pretty much one level above Scratch. Having said that, a lot of very popular games over the last few years have been developed in the engine, going all the way back to Yumi Nikki in the early 2000s, and more recently games like Omori, which shows that the engine absolutely has the potential to make popular games. I haven't seen any finished games using the 3D plugin. However, for the sort of game that I'm making, I do believe I'm keeping the scope relatively managed, and this will allow me to create something quite unique, fits within the limitations of RPG Maker. Thank you very much for listening today. I hope I've gone some way into explaining why I'm using the RPG Maker engine to create this game. If you want to support me, I've recently launched a Patreon, and anyone who signs up before the 23rd of April will be given the opportunity to include their personal message in my game. Also, if you want to support me here on YouTube, best thing you guys can do is comment, like, and subscribe if you're not. Thank you very much.